My name is Hans-Ulrich Wittchen, Vice President of ECNP, and I would like to talk today about the size and the burden and the cost of mental and disorders of the brain. First of all, I think it's very important that people recognize that mental disorders and disorders of the brain comprise a large variety of different conditions. They range in the field of mental disorders, from mental retardation over anxiety disorders, depression, to things like post-traumatic stress disorder, sleep disturbances, eating disorders, and neurocognitive disorders like dementia. On a wider scale, disorders of the brain comprise also all the neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis as examples. And these two groups together, the neurological and the mental disorders together, is what we call disorders of the brain, because they all share the common pathway. They also share a lot of mechanisms that are involved in the etiology and the cause of these disorders. So, the ECNP and the European Brain Council, a couple of years ago, actually recognized the need that we need improved up-to-date data about the size and the burden and the cost of these conditions. And they also actually thought that for the very first time we have to make an attempt to bring together all the knowledge from all these disorders in the enlarged European Union states and trying to see actually how frequently they occur and with what kind of impairment and disabilities they are associated and how well they are treated. And in order to do this, we established a very complex working platform that has done this tremendous work by looking through the literature, doing reanalysis, trying to compute actually the information that is available for Europe as a whole. Now, what have been the results of this tremendous effort that has been going on for several years? Well, first of all, it's very important to see that it's still not possible to actually present data on mental disorders and neurological disorders in one figure. So what you see here is basically two figures. One is the frequency of mental disorders, where the most frequent conditions are the anxiety and depressive disorders, as well as dementia. Whereas the rarer disorders are things like obsessive-compulsive disorders or eating disorders. And on the other side, you see the neurological disorders, of which the most frequent conditions are the various forms of headache that dominate the picture, as well as stroke and dementias that are grouped actually in both. And what we found is that among the total population in the European Union, 164.8 million of people were affected actually by one of the conditions during the past year. This is an immensely high number because it accounts for more than 1/3 of the total EU population. So the question came up from politicians and the public. Are we in an epidemic of disorders of the brain? Are depressive, anxiety disorders and other conditions increasing? And the answer that we provided is pretty astonishing to many, because overall there is no evidence that there is an increase of these conditions when we look at certain age groups and by gender. We find pretty similar findings, for example, for depression of 7%, in the data 10 years ago as we do right now. And although the estimate that we reported 10 years ago seems to be higher, it is entirely due to the fact that we include more disorders of the brain than we did previously. However, the number of people in Europe affected by these disorders are significantly different. They are much larger than previously thought. And this is due to several factors. First, this time we took into account Europe as a whole, so the total population of over 500 million people. And secondly, of course, we have a higher number of diagnoses covered this time. But most importantly, during the 10 years, the life expectancy of the population has changed, which means people get substantially older, several years older than 10 years ago. which means they also live longer with that condition, and they live longer at a time where the risk factors for complications and additional mental disorders of the brain increase, for example, due to dementia, Parkinson's disease, or neurodegeneration. As a result of both, we found that the estimated number of persons actually is substantially larger than 10 years ago. So, how disabling are they? And as many of you might know, there are various metrics to describe for all disorders actually how to measure the impact of a disorder for the society as a whole. And one of the measures is years lived with disability, describing the proportion of disorders that have to live with a disability for many years. And what you see on this slide here is that 42% of all years lived with disability are attributed to neuropsychiatric conditions, which means almost half of all years of disability in the European Union created by all kinds of diseases, may it be cancer, diabetes, are due to disorders of the brain. And if we take into account mortality, the matrix there is called daily, the disability adjusted life years, then we see that this proportion drops to 28%. Because most mental disorders are not fatal, they don't kill yourself immediately, but they cause long-term disability. And that is very important, of course, for our healthcare systems because we are not prepared for this yet. So we calculated, based on very complex modeling, actually, the burden for each of the disorders considered, and we did this separately by males and females. And there are substantial differences in the disability profile of males and females. The most disabling condition for females is by far depression. The most disabling condition for males is alcohol use disorders, in particular alcohol dependence. And so overall, you see there's a substantial difference between the disability associated with males and females. So, seeing these numbers, it might not be that surprising anymore to see that mental disorders overall are an incredible burden for the society. The total costs amount for mental disorders alone to 675,000 billion euros, an immense number, which is far larger than the total expenditure of any healthcare system actually in the European Union. Now, why is it so? As you can see here, only 31% of the total cost burden of mental disorders is due to direct costs like diagnostic measures and treatment, whereas overall for mental and neurological disorders 46% are indirect costs, which are the costs due to the fact that you can't work anymore, that you fall out of your job, that you get unemployed because you are sick. And so this is something that is quite alarming overall, because if you compare that with other treatable diseases like cardiovascular diseases or diabetes, you see that mental disorders in particular are dramatically different. For depression, you see that the direct healthcare cost is a small proportion of the total cost, whereas for diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, the direct costs are dominating the pictures. So the question is now, would an increase of the direct cost for better and timely treatments reduce the indirect cost burden created by mental disorders and the overall cost burden eventually? And I think this is the challenge that we have to resolve in the next couple of years. So let me conclude. According to our data, we feel confident to say that mental disorders are the core challenge of the 21st century. Mental disorders are very prevalent, affecting every year more than 1/3 of the European population. Mental disorders are very disabling, being responsible for 42% of all years lived with disability in the overall spectrum of diseases. And mental disorders alone cause the highest proportion of disease burden of all disease groups we considered. It's also important to say that the situation in Europe is different from the rest of the world. We already have depression as the most burdensome disorder of all diseases, whereas other parts of the world have not yet arrived at this stage. The cost burden in Europe is immense, not because of the treatment cost, not about the direct treatment cost, because only less than 5% of the total cost go currently into drugs, intervention, psychotherapy, but because of the long-term disability costs that are actually due to the impairment and the disability. I think Europe has to do something. We have to act to reduce the burden, and we have only been partially successful doing this so far. We have to provide treatment earlier and more appropriately than we did in the past. We have to provide better prevention. We have to personalize the treatment to address better the patient's needs for treatment. And we have to develop overall better treatment systems. And our hope from the ECNP side is that we will be able, together with the European Commission, to draft such an agenda to change the situation. Thank you very much.